Welcome to this week's video of Tuesdays with Thomas. Today we're going to talk about the fifth way, Thomas's argument for God, that sometimes is called an argument from design. However, this argument is not the same kind of argument from design as popular current arguments from design, like the argument found in Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. In this book, Behe argues that there are certain processes in nature that are comprised of various different parts that all have to exist simultaneously in order for a system to work. He uses the example of the flagellum of a bacteria. These parts could not have evolved piece by piece, but must exist together at the same time in order for this little spinning tail of the bacteria to work at all. He refers to these kinds of systems by the phrase irreducible complexity. Well, Aquinas' argument from design is not this kind of argument, nor is it the same kind of argument as the more famous predecessor of Behe's argument, made famous by William Paley, his famous watchmaker argument, which I will talk about in just a second. Well, just exactly what kind of argument from design is Aquinas' argument? To understand the answer to this question, we must go back to Aristotle, who of course is the foundational philosopher of Aquinas' understanding of the natural world. So you might remember in a previous lesson we talked about the four causes of Aristotle. I'm going to use this chair as an illustration. If we ask the question, why does this chair exist, we might say that it exists because there was a chair maker. We might say that it exists because there is wood and there is wicker that was assembled together. We might say that it exists because there's a certain pattern or form, a concept of chair that the wood and wicker were shaped into. Or we might say that it exists because someone wanted to sit down, so they had to have something shaped together. Well, these four answers illustrate Aristotle's four causes. The chair maker is the efficient cause. The wood and wicker, the materials, are the material cause. The concept or configuration of the chair is the formal cause, and the purpose of the chair is its final cause. And even though we use the word final to indicate the purpose of the chair, actually in the order of causes, it comes first. It has priority. After all, you can only know what the configuration of this thing will be and how to make it and what to make it from if you know what its purpose is first. In this case, to have something to sit down in. Now, I'm only using this chair as an illustration because it's easy to relate to. Aristotle was actually far more concerned with this sort of thing in nature. He was really a scientist. So let's think about the heart. The efficient cause of the heart, in our understanding of science, would be DNA, the coding that sent the information to construct the heart. The material cause would be the particular tissues that comprise the muscles that are the heart. The formal cause would be the configuration of those tissues, the arteries and the veins and so forth that make the heart, as opposed to some other configuration like the brain or the lungs. And then there is the final cause, the purpose of the heart, which is to pump blood. Now, this understanding of nature, the four causes, were the dominant view from the time of Aristotle until the 1700s or the 1600s. And at that time, because of the rise of scientific technology, philosophers began to dispute the notion that there were formal and final causes. They began to see all of the natural world in mechanical terms. And just like machines are composed of little parts, like, for example, screws and nuts and bolts, they began to see the natural world in the same way. They did not see in the natural world, therefore, design that was built into or immanent to the natural world. Instead, it all had to be superimposed. Maybe you have a drawer at your house, like I have in my desk, that is just, if you open it up, there's all kinds of screws and nails and bolts that are just loose and lying around. That's basically how philosophers began to see the natural world. If there's any order, it has to be completely superimposed from outside. So as a result of that, philosophers began to deny the notion that there is formal and final causality in the natural world. This viewpoint came to be called the mechanical philosophy. Now, that did not mean that they threw out the idea of God. It just meant that they radically redefined how there is design and order in the natural world. It had to be completely imposed from the outside. Here's a diagram of Isaac Newton's view of physics, in which the solar system, for example, is pictured in terms of a giant machine, in which all the moving parts of the celestial bodies are moving as if they are turned on gears, shifting along the same lines as maybe the shifting gears of a clock or a watch. That's the perfect representation of the mechanical philosophy. And of course, it is this kind of thinking that is the basis of William Paley's famous watchmaker illustration for the existence of God. Here's how he begins his book called Natural Theology. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that, for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? For this reason and for no other, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive, what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. Now, as he goes on to talk about it, he describes the casing of the watch and the springs and the chain and the wheels and the teeth that are in the wheels and so forth. But if you think about it, none of those particular parts of the watch have any natural relationship to each other. It is a purely synthetic relationship to each other, a mechanical relationship to each other that must be imposed from outside. In other words, Paley's view is the mechanical philosophy, just with an external design. Now then, William Dembski, who is one of the modern proponents of this version of the intelligent design argument, makes a very important admission in his book called The Design Revolution. He says, with the rise of modern science in the 17th century, design arguments took a mechanical turn. The mechanical philosophy that was prevalent at the birth of modern science viewed the world as an assemblage of material particles interacting by mechanical forces. Within this view, design was constructed as externally imposed form on pre-existing inert matter. On the next page, he says, the British natural theologians of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, starting with Boyle and Ray and culminating in the natural theology of Paley, looked to biological systems for convincing evidence that a designer had acted in the physical world. For many, it was the traditional Christian God, but for others, it was a deistic God who had created the world but played no ongoing role in governing it. In other words, with the mechanical philosophy, you could basically have some kind of super intelligent being who winds up the world like a clock and then just lets it run and sits back and does nothing else. That is deism, which became a very popular belief in the 17 and 1800s, which meant there's no divine intervention, no miracles, no resurrection of Jesus, and that kind of denial of the supernatural in general. So then, from Aristotle and his belief in innate causation to the natural world, we moved to the mechanical philosophy, which said, no, if there's any order and design in the natural world, it must be imposed from the outside. Well, then along comes Charles Darwin, who provides an explanation for what appears to be design, but in fact is not design at all. So from shifting from the theism of Aristotle to the eventual deism of the mechanical philosophy, it wasn't that much more of a step to say there isn't any design and order that needs to be imposed from without. There's no one to wind up the clock because these mechanical parts that have no innate order to them are in fact not ordered at all. It just appears that way. And this paved the way then to the rise of atheism and to materialism, to naturalism philosophically. So here's what I want to do is I want to look at the text of Aquinas' fifth way and see what a completely different argument it is from design than these more popularly understood arguments from design. It's a very simple but profound argument. He says this: the fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. So right off the bat, we need to understand that this argument is going to be fundamentally about God's sustaining providence of the world. He says, we see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and this is evident from their acting always, or nearly always, in the same way so as to obtain the best result. When he talks about natural bodies, it could be something like a match that is struck, an acorn that is planted, an egg that hatches, just any natural thing. And he says they act for an end. In other words, he's talking about final causes. And he says we see that they act always or nearly always in the same way. In other words, what Aquinas is talking about here are the many regularities we see in the natural world. But why are they so regular? That's the whole point of the argument here. So here's what Thomas goes on to say. Hence it is plain that not fortuitously but designedly do they achieve their end. Well, why is it, Thomas, that they can't be so regular simply because of chance? Well, here's the reason that it can't just simply be dismissed by chance. Thomas uses an illustration that goes back to a philosopher named Boethius about a farmer finding a hidden treasure. I found an article from back in the fall where this actually took place. A farmer in Switzerland found an ancient Roman treasure that had been buried on his property. That seems like a chance occurrence, but actually it involves a lot of purposeful design. The farmer was intentionally digging his property. Whoever buried that treasure centuries ago intentionally tried to hide that treasure. And so while on the surface this was a chance occurrence, it actually is undergirded by several purposeful designed activities. And the same is true in the natural realm. Here's a picture of Darwin's classic finches. We know that now mutations take place on the genetic level, which lead to adaptation. That seems like it's random. And yet those random mutations can only occur by chance because beneath the surface there is the order of DNA, there is the order of reproduction, there is the order of the adaptive process of natural selection itself. And so the point is that in order for there to be something like adaptation at all, we are presupposing a natural, orderly process. And so yes, there is a level of randomness or chance to it, but it's undergirded by something that requires design inherent and immanent to nature itself. National Geographic says an adaptation is a mutation or genetic change that helps an organism, such as a plant or animal, survive in its environment. This all presupposes that there are orderly processes of nature that make these chance occurrences possible. And that's why chance is no obstacle to the fifth way once you understand what Aquinas is talking about. So moving out of the text, he says, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move toward an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. In other words, Thomas is saying all the natural regularities that we see around us are not driven by themselves to their end by intelligence. They must be, therefore, guided to their end by God himself. So here's how Aquinas' view of design is different from Paley. Paley says nature has no inherent design. It must be imposed externally, like the cogs and wheels of a machine. Aquinas says nature has inherent design, but it must be directed externally. Paley says that design is all about complexity. What Aquinas says is design is all about regularity in nature. And what Paley says is that design really has to do with things being made. But what Aquinas says is, no, it's much more than that. It is about God's providence, his governance, his ruling of nature, sustaining it moment by moment. This is why the God of Aquinas' argument cannot simply be the God of deism who just starts the world, winds it up, and lets it go. But rather, moment by moment, he is sustaining and guiding everything we see that bears the hallmarks of intelligence, order, and rationality.